Niobrara breaks, Nebraska, October, 1888. The prairie grass was cured to the color of old brass, and the wind, that constant, invisible resident of the plains, had a new sharpness to its voice. It spoke of what was coming. On a small claim overlooking the river, Hidde Bouma was building something that made no sense. He wasn't building up, he was building out. The low walls of his soddy, barely 4 feet high, were nearly complete. But now, instead of framing a proper roof with gables and a proud ridgepole, he was setting rafters at a long, shallow angle, their ends nearly touching the ground on 3 sides of the structure. It looked less like the beginning of a house and more like the skeleton of a great flattened beast. Cassius Threlkeld, owner of the lumber yard in town and a man whose opinions were as solid and square as the timbers he sold, reined in his horse. Beside him 2 homesteaders, Orville Peck and Jebediah Finch, stared in disbelief. "Bouma!" Threlkeld called out, his voice carrying easily on the wind. "What in God's name is that?" Hidde Bouma, a man as spare and weathered as a fence post, paused his work. He was lashing willow purlins to the cottonwood rafters. He looked at the 3 men on horseback, his gaze calm, his face unreadable. "A roof," he said, his Frisian accent thickening the simple words. Threlkeld laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "A roof? It looks like you're building a haystack to live in. That pitch is so low it'll hold 100 tons of snow, and the eaves are practically in the dirt. You planning on grazing cattle on your shingles?" Peck and Finch chuckled along with him. Finch, who had bought his own lumber from Threlkeld just last spring, shook his head. "It's foolish, Hidde. The first chimney spark that lands on that. And your family burns in their beds. It's a tinderbox, not a roof." Booma's eyes, the pale blue of a winter sky, met Threlkeld's. He said nothing for a moment, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "The sparks are a worry," he conceded quietly. He then turned back to his work, pulling a knot tight with practiced efficiency. The conversation for him was over. Threlkeld sat on his horse, affronted by the dismissal. He was an expert. He had supplied the lumber for nearly every sound structure in 3 counties. He understood the forces at play here, the crushing weight of snow, the lifting force of the wind, the ever-present danger of fire. This immigrant, this Dutchman, or whatever he was ignoring a century of hard-won frontier knowledge. "You're a madman, Bouma," Threlkeld declared to the man's back. "That thing won't see Christmas." As the 3 men rode off, their laughter trailing behind them, Hidde Bouma continued his work, his movements methodical and unhurried. The mockery was just another sound in the wind, and the wind was the one thing he was listening to. What did this Frisian Reitdecker, this Thatcher from the storm-scoured coast of the North Sea, understand about the physics of wind that a professional lumberman, a master of conventional wisdom, had missed entirely? The answer lay not in the vast, open spaces of Nebraska, but in a landscape half a world away, a flat, wet country of canals and dikes, where the wind blew without obstacle from the sea. Hidde Bouma was not a carpenter. He had never been a farmer, not in the way Nebraskans understood it. He was a man whose hands knew the intimate language of reed and twine, of the thatching needle and the mallet. His world had been one of Phragmites australis, the common reed, harvested from brackish marshes, its hollow stems both strong and light. He understood the precise angle of a roof pitch not in degrees, but in the way it shed water and, more importantly, the way it shed the gales that swept in from the sea, gales that could peel a slate roof from a church and send it scattering across the polder. He had brought his wife, Anki, and their 2 children, 10-year-old Jella and 7-year-old Makey, to America for the promise of land. But the land came with a price, and that price was the winter. Their first year, 1887, had been a lesson in humility, taught in a hastily constructed soddy built to the exact specifications of their neighbors. It was a box with a roof, a standard design meant to stand up to the weather. Instead, it seemed to invite the weather in for a long and miserable visit. That first winter was a litany of small sufferings that compounded into a constant, grinding misery. The stovepipe, where it passed through the sod roof, was never perfectly sealed. On windy nights, it whistled a high, mournful note, a constant reminder of the cold's assault. Anki would say it sounded like the reed flutes from the old country, a sound that made their exile feel all the more acute. The bacon, hanging near the wall, would set so hard in the cold that slicing it was like trying to cut stone. Mornings were the worst. The children would wake with their own breath frozen in crystalline patterns on the blankets, and more than once Anki had to gently pry Make's long braids from the sod wall where they had frozen fast to the frost-laced dirt as she slept. Hidde, a man of quiet observation, spent that winter not just enduring, but studying. He watched the fine, dry snow, so different from the wet snow of Friesland, as it was driven by the wind. He saw how it didn't just fall. It flowed, like a fluid, finding every crack and crevice. He felt the drafts not as random intrusions, but as predictable currents. The problem, he realized, wasn't the cold. The cold was a constant. The problem was the wind. The wind was the engine of their misery. On the plains, conventional wisdom built walls to fight the wind. A Nebraska sod house or a frame cabin was a vertical obstruction, a bluff object placed in the path of a relentless current of air. The wind would hit the windward wall, compress, and accelerate as it went up and over the roof. This acceleration created a low-pressure zone, a pocket of near vacuum, just above the roof's surface. The higher pressure inside the house would then push upwards, trying to equalize, lifting the shingles, the tar paper, the sod blocks themselves. The eaves, the very feature designed to shed water, acted like a spoiler in reverse, catching the wind and providing the perfect lip for it to grab hold and peel the roof away. Every rattling window, every groaning timber, every whistling stovepipe was the sound of a house losing a battle of brute force against an opponent that could not tire. Hidde's neighbors were good, hard-working people. They fought the winter with the only weapon they had: fuel. Jebediah Finch's family burned through cords of precious cottonwood, their stove glowing red-hot day and night. Yet his wife still hung blankets over the doorways, and their children slept in their coats. The heat rose straight to the rafters and was immediately stolen by the wind scouring the roof above. They were trying to heat the entire state of Nebraska, one armload of wood at a time. The flaw was not in their effort. It was in their design. The design was the enemy. So in the autumn of 1888, Hidde Bouma began to build his answer. He ignored Threlkeld's plans, the ones that worked well enough for everyone else. He started by harvesting. For weeks, he and Jelle waded into the marshy banks of the Niobrara River, cutting dense stands of phragmites reeds. They were the same species he knew from home, a gift from the new land. He bundled them carefully, letting them dry in the sun. Thousands of hollow tubes, each one a tiny pocket of trapped air, a perfect natural insulator. His construction was a strange hybrid of old-world knowledge and new-world materials. The low sod walls provided a solid, earth-sheltered base. Then came the roof structure, the part that so baffled his neighbors. He laid the main cottonwood rafters at a gentle 30-degree pitch, not the steep 45 degrees common in the area. The key was what happened at the bottom. The rafters didn't stop at the wall. They overhung it by several feet, their ends coming to rest on a low berm of earth he had built around the house. On three sides, north, west, and south, the roof would sweep down from the central ridgepole to meet the ground itself. Only the east-facing front of the house, with its single door and two small windows presented a vertical face. Then came the thatching. It was an art form. He started at the bottom, laying the first course of reeds with their tips pointing downwards, their thicker butt ends pointing up towards the ridge. Each course was laid thick, overlapping the one below it and compacted tightly. He used tarred twine to lash the reeds to the willow purlins, using a long, heavy needle to push the twine through the dense mat. Layer upon layer, the roof grew, not as a separate covering, but as an integral part of the structure's shape. He worked with a patient, rhythmic motion, his hands moving with a certainty that unnerved the onlookers. It was a skill so foreign it looked like magic. The roof grew to a thickness of 18 inches. It was a dense, tightly woven carapace of hollow stems. When he was done, he trimmed the eaves with a long, sharp blade, giving them a clean, finished edge. Finally, he addressed the most critical junction, where the thatch met the ground. He laid heavy blocks of sod, the sod-toed eaves of his tradition, along the entire perimeter. These heavy blocks anchored the bottom course of thatch, preventing any wind from getting underneath and starting the deadly process of lifting. It also wickeded moisture away from the base of the reeds, preventing rot. Threlkeld rode out a second time, a week before the first snow. He saw the nearly finished structure, and his professional disdain only deepened. "I see you've finished your haystack, Bouma," he said, not bothering to dismount. "I came to make a final offer on proper lumber. I'll even give you a discount, for your wife and children's sake. That thing is a fire trap. You know that, don't you?" Threlkeld's objection was rooted in sound frontier logic. A spark from the chimney landing on a conventional roof of damp sod or even wooden shingles had a chance to smolder and go out. But a spark landing on 18 inches of dry reed? It was unthinkable. "The top layers are combed," Hidde explained, pointing with his chin towards the peak. "The wind keeps them clean. And the chimney?" He gestured to the simple stovepipe. He had surrounded its exit point with a wide collar of pounded clay and then fitted a sleeve of sheet metal around it, creating a foot of non-combustible clearance in every direction. It was a simple, elegant solution. "The pipe is clear." "It's not enough," Threlkeld insisted, his voice taking on a lecturing tone. "One hot ember on a dry, windy night, and the whole roof ignites. You're putting your family to sleep inside a torch. It's irresponsible." Hidde looked at the lumberman. He understood the man's fear. It was the fear of the unknown. But Hidde's knowledge was older than Threlkeld's. "In my country," he said slowly, "we have built this way for 1,000 years. Our fires are in the hearth, not on the roof." He turned and went inside, leaving Threlkeld to stare at the bizarre, organic shape hunkered down on the prairie. It looked like a part of the earth, a sleeping animal. The physics behind Hidde's design was a direct refutation of the frontier's architectural ethos. He wasn't building a fortress to defy the wind. He was building a shape that refused to fight it at all. Aerodynamics, a science that would not have a name for decades, was at the heart of his craft. When the relentless Nebraska wind encountered a standard cabin, it was like a river hitting a square-faced boulder. The flow was violently disrupted. The wind slammed into the vertical wall, creating a high-pressure zone. This compressed air had to go somewhere, so it accelerated upwards, racing over the sharp angle of the eave and across the roof plane. This rapidly moving air created a powerful area of low pressure above the roof, an effect the physicist Daniel Bernoulli would later codify. The result was lift. The same principle that allows a bird's wing to fly was, in this case, trying to make the roof fly. The force could be immense, amounting to tons of upward pressure in a 50-mile-per-hour gust. The nails and pegs holding the roof down were in a constant battle against this invisible giant trying to pry it off. Hidde's structure did the opposite. By sweeping the roofline almost to the ground, he eliminated the vertical wall on the three most exposed sides. When the wind arrived, it encountered not a wall, but a gentle, inclined ramp. There was no sudden collision, no violent disruption. The airflow remained largely attached to the surface, flowing smoothly up and over the house. It was like a river flowing over a smooth, rounded stone on the stream bed. Because the wind speed didn't increase dramatically, no significant low-pressure zone was formed. There was no lift. The roof was not being torn from the house. It was being gently pressed onto it by the weight of the moving air. Furthermore, the 18 inches of dense thatch provided an astonishing level of insulation. Each of the millions of hollow reed stems was a pocket of dead air. Heat moves in three ways: conduction, through direct contact; convection, through air movement; and radiation, through electromagnetic waves. A solid log wall is a poor insulator because heat conducts straight through it. A drafty cabin loses most of its heat to convection, as cold air gets in and warm air gets out. Hidde's roof defeated both. The sheer thickness and trapped air of the thatch dramatically slowed conduction. And because the structure was aerodynamically stable, the wind couldn't create the pressure differences that drive infiltration in drafts. The house didn't leak air. It was a sealed, breathing, but fundamentally calm environment. Hidde didn't know the terms laminar flow, or BTU, or R value. He knew the feel of a still candle flame in a gale. He knew the quiet hum a roof made when it was happy in the wind. He knew the scent of dry reeds and the heft of a wet sod block. His knowledge was tactile, hereditary, and, in the context of the Niobrara breaks in 1888, utterly revolutionary. He had not built a wall against the wind. He had taught the wind there was no wall to find. The real test began on January 12, 1889. The day dawned strangely warm and still, a weather breeder. By mid-afternoon, the sky to the northwest turned a terrifying shade of bruised purple. Then the world disappeared. The Schoolhouse Blizzard, a storm that would enter prairie folklore as a benchmark for meteorological violence, struck not as a gradual decline, but as a sudden, brutal onslaught. The temperature plummeted from a mild 30 degrees Fahrenheit to 28 below zero in a matter of hours. The wind arrived as a solid wall, a steady 50-mile-per-hour roar with gusts that shook the foundations of the very earth. And with it came the snow, not flakes, but a fine, blinding powder, as sharp as sand, that seemed to move horizontally. Inside Jebediah Finch's cabin, the world was a screaming chaos. The wind hit the north wall with the force of a physical blow, and the entire structure groaned in protest. Fine, stinging snow forced its way through every chink in the log walls, through the window frames, and down the chimney, where it hissed on the stove. Mrs. Finch stuffed rags into the gaps, but it was like trying to dam a river with handkerchiefs. They fed the stove constantly, but the heat was stolen as fast as it was produced. The sound was deafening. A continuous high-pitched shriek that vibrated in their bones and made conversation impossible. At the Threlkeld house in town, a fine two-story frame building, Cassius and his family huddled in the parlor, the warmest room. They had moved mattresses downstairs. Even with the stove roaring, the windows were coated in a thick layer of opaque ice on the inside. Every 10 minutes, a gust would hit the house like a freight train, and they would hear the rafters creak ominously. Threlkeld, a man who believed in the soundness of his own construction, felt a knot of fear in his stomach. This was different. This was a wind with teeth and claws. Inside Hidde Bouma's reed mound, it was quiet. The gale outside was a distant, muffled roar, like the sound of a faraway waterfall. There were no drafts. The candle on the small wooden table burned with a steady, unwavering flame. The air was cool, but not cold. The small stove needed feeding only every few hours, its gentle warmth radiating through the single, open room. Yella and Mikey played a game with dried corn kernels on the floor, their movements relaxed and easy. They were not wearing coats. Anka was knitting, her needles clicking with a peaceful rhythm. Earlier, she had set a crock of fresh cream on the sill of the west-facing window, a small pane set deep into the thick wall. She'd intended to let it cool to make butter the next day, but as the storm raged, a strange thing began to happen. The immense, constant pressure of the wind on the outside of the structure was transferred into a barely perceptible, high-frequency vibration. The entire house hummed with a deep, resonant note, the sound of a living thing bracing against the storm. The vibration traveled through the sod wall, up through the wooden windowsill, and into the crock of cream. Hour after hour, the storm churned. By dawn, the cream on the sill had risen, thickened, and separated. It had become a perfect pale yellow pat of sweet butter. For 4 days, the world ceased to exist outside the walls of the homes. The wind never stopped. The snow never stopped. The cold never stopped. It was a siege. When the storm finally broke on the 4th morning, the silence was as shocking as the noise had been. The sun rose on a landscape transformed, a world buried and scoured clean. The prairie was a sea of white dunes, the familiar contours of the land erased. Cassius Threlkeld's first thought was business. How many of his customers had lost roofs? How much lumber would be needed for repairs? He saddled his sturdiest horse and began a grim tour of his territory. The devastation was worse than he had imagined. Barns were flattened into piles of splintered wood. Porches were ripped clean from houses. He passed the Peck homestead and saw that their entire woodshed was simply gone, vanished. He rode towards the river, towards the Finch claim. From a distance, he could see something was wrong. The cabin looked short. As he got closer, the horror became clear. The 4 log walls were still standing, but the roof was gone. Not damaged, not partially collapsed. It had been lifted clean off and smashed to pieces 100 yards away in a gully. Inside the roofless ruin, he saw the Finch family huddled around a pitiful, smoking fire, their faces black with soot, their blankets covered in snow. Jebediah looked up at him with hollow eyes, a man broken by the storm. Threlkeld felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had sold Finch that lumber. He had vouched for that design. He urged his horse on, his mind a turmoil of guilt and dawning fear. Downwind from the Finch place, on its low rise, was the Bouma claim. He fully expected to find nothing but a scattered pile of reeds, the foolish Immigrant's project obliterated. He topped a small ridge and looked down, and there it was. It wasn't a ruin. It was a smooth, snow-covered mound, a new hill on the prairie landscape, its gentle slopes barely distinguishable from the surrounding drifts, and from the very peak, a thin, clean thread of gray smoke rose straight into the still, frigid air. It was a sign of life, of warmth, of impossible normalcy. He rode closer, his horse crunching through the crusted snow. The place was utterly serene. There was no debris, no sign of a struggle. The storm had simply passed over it. He dismounted and walked towards the east-facing door. He ran a gloved hand along the frozen reeds of the south wall. He expected to feel the bite of the wind that always seemed to cling to a structure's edge, the small, vicious drafts that found their way through any barrier. He felt nothing. The air beside the house was perfectly still. It was as if the wind itself respected the boundary. He reached the front of the house. Hidde Bouma stepped out, blinking in the bright sun. He held a wooden bucket. He looked at Threlkeld, his expression neutral. "Bouma," Threlkeld said, his own voice hoarse. Your roof. It held. Yes, Hidde said simply. It is a good roof. Threlkeld gestured numbly back the way he had come. Finches is gone, Peck's shed. Everyone, damage everywhere. He looked at the impossible structure, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew to be true. He saw the small window beside the door. On the sill, inside the glass, sat a crock. In the crock was a mound of fresh, yellow butter. He stared at it. In his own home, a bowl of milk left in the pantry had frozen into a solid disk of ice. He looked from the butter to Bouma's face. The quiet confidence he had once mistaken for arrogance, he now saw as simple knowledge. The frontiersman's certainty, his own certainty, had been based on fighting the prairie. Bouma's was based on understanding it. In that moment of silent comprehension, Cassius Threlkeld, the lumberman, the purveyor of conventional wisdom, felt the foundations of his own expertise crack. He expected to feel the sting of being proven wrong, the humiliation of a public mistake. Instead, what he felt was a profound and overwhelming sense of awe. Hidde, he said, the name feeling different in his mouth now, respectful. How? Hidde looked out at the scoured landscape, then back at his house. You do not build a wall for the wind, he said. The wind is too strong. You build a shape that shows it the way to go. Threlkeld finally understood. You didn't build a fortress, you built a hill. The conversion of Cassius Threlkeld was as swift and total as the blizzard itself. He was, above all, a practical man. He had witnessed a miracle of engineering, and he recognized its value. He didn't just apologize to Hidde, he became his advocate. That spring, a strange new commodity appeared at Threlkeld's lumberyard. Huge, neatly tied bundles of Phragmites reeds, harvested from the river by Hidde and his son. Threlkeld printed a handbill, a simple one-sheet advertisement. It had a crude drawing of a low, rounded house on one side. On the other, it read, "Stop heating the state of Nebraska. Stop losing your roof. The Frisian mound house, windproof, warm, half the fuel, twice the comfort. Inquire at Threlkeld Lumber." He sent the handbills out with his delivery wagons to homesteaders and sod house claimants across 3 counties. At first, people were skeptical, but the story of the Schoolhouse Blizzard and of the one roof that had stood serene amidst the devastation was a powerful one. Jebediah Finch, his family having barely survived, was the first to hire Hidde to supervise the construction of a new roof. By the following autumn, 7 more Bouma mounds dotted the landscape. The next year, there were 24. The owners reported astonishing results: fuel consumption cut by more than half, and a profound sense of security they had never known before. The quiet inside, they all said, was the most remarkable thing. Hidde Bouma never sought fame or recognition. He was a craftsman, and he shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked. He would walk them through the process, explaining the importance of compacting the reeds, of anchoring the eaves, of keeping the shape low and smooth. He didn't speak of physics or aerodynamics. He spoke of water and wind and the way a willow bends. The innovation he brought to the Niobrara breaks was a curious echo of the past, a piece of ancient wisdom perfectly suited to a new and hostile environment. Decades later, engineers designing aircraft and automobiles would use wind tunnels to study the very principles of laminar flow and drag that Hidde Bouma understood in his bones. His reed-thatched roof, mocked as a primitive haystack, was, in fact, a remarkably sophisticated piece of aerodynamic architecture, anticipating the streamlining of the modern age by half a century. The story of Hidde Bouma is a quiet testament to a truth the frontier rewarded above all others: what works, works. It is a reminder that the most revolutionary ideas often come not from the center of a culture, but from its edges, carried by outsiders who see a familiar problem with new eyes. The loud, confident voices of established expertise are often the last to recognize a breakthrough. True wisdom is rarely loud. It proves itself not with argument, but with results. With a warm house, a sleeping child, a steady candle flame in the heart of a blizzard. Hidde Bouma didn't raise a wall against the wind. He taught the wind there was no wall to find. Disclaimer. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices of thatching and vernacular architecture. The application of any building technique in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.